Welcome to the Precision Protocol series brought to you by Biocanic. In this series, we're nerd out on the world of personalized health, functional medicine, clinical research, and cutting-edge wellness strategies. We explore the advanced science, clinical applications, and the real-world impact of precision protocols designed to optimize client outcomes. This episode, we're going to deep dive into omics. Really excited to have our guest, Dr. Anil, here with us. For those of you that are watching live, feel free to drop in your comments. We'll get to them as we go. But otherwise, I am Jeremy, the CEO of Biocanic. I am joined by my fellow data nerd, Brendan Vermeire, and really excited to have our guest today, Dr. Anil, the best-selling book author of the longevity equation.
You have a copy of that, huh?
the step-by-step blueprint to hack your genes, optimize your health, and master the art of existence. Awesome. Welcome, Anil. How you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much for having me, guys. Always a pleasure connecting.
Awesome. I think it'd be good to kind of talk about your background, kind of where you're at. You know, like we talked about earlier, we work with a lot of functional medicine practitioners, typical supplements, medications, testing, but really where you're focused on is really kind of the future of multi-omics, all of the new stuff coming to market. And I'd love to kind of hear about your background, and then we'll jump right into the deep end of the pool.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. So my background is actually in molecular microbiology and medical laboratory science, and I'm a board certified family physician by training, with additional training in anti-aging regenerative medicine, functional medicine. I've been studying in this field for the past 25 years. And as I've, gone through the space and gathered information, I've kind of amalgamated my own kind of a unique approach to leveraging all the different molecular diagnostics into a comprehensive suite of, just analysis to kind of paint a picture of somebody's unique, molecular phenotype. And I leverage that here clinically, and that kind of gave rise to a couple of things. One of them is one of the classes that I teach at George Washington University, the Omics of Medicine, INTM 6205, where I teach fellows in this field how to start leveraging omics in clinical practice. And this further got evolved into me discovering and I kind of feel weird saying it, but founding the American Board of Precision Medicine. And so I really believe this is going to be the future of healthcare, leveraging these different molecular diagnostics. And, I think we, as physicians need to lean into it and utilize all these different molecular diagnostics that are at our disposable, so that we could just get a better appreciation of what's going on with our patients in front of us.
Awesome. And then maybe just for a definitional standpoint, what is omics, right? Where, we hear about genomics, and then we do functional lab testing on the metabolite side, but maybe kind of bridge the gap of like where all of this comes together in your view.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think, first of all, precision medicine is defined as the interface of biology, lifestyle, and environment, right? And there was a NIH initiative that was launched back in during the Obama administration to push this initiative forward. And to me, that sounds like just really good medicine. And omics refers to the unique suite of biological sciences in a well-orchestrated molecular framework. And we study biology 101, and there's this concept of the central dogma of biology, which refers to DNA into RNA and RNA into protein. That's, transcription and translation. But furthermore, it refers to how, the study of DNA is genomics, the study of RNA is transcriptomics, the study of proteins is proteomics, metabolism, metabolomics, microbiomics, exposomics, and environmental medicine, the epigenome, and so on and so forth. But how do we use this information to make translational applications and connecting the molecular dots into identifying somebody's unique, kind of molecular phenotype? Is kind of, what I'm working on here clinically. And that kind of gives a background of, all the different layers of omic data and how it kind of is leveraged into this unique precision medicine framework.
And maybe just to dive in, kind of walk through how your approach would be different than what you would see in traditional quote unquote functional medicine.
So, I love functional medicine. I think Jeff Bland is one of, most influential mentors. And I've been studying it for so many years now. It started off when I was like 20 years old with Tatis Karazian with the Karazian Institute, and got into the whole functional blood chemistry and functional neurology applications, and then went on to formalize that foundational studies with IFM, the Institute for Functional Medicine. But the IFM provides a very unique framework with leveraging this root cause analysis, where they have their functional medicine timeline. They have what's called the functional medicine matrix, where they look at the inner associations of these different domains, regulatory domains. And then they also have this framework of leveraging something called ATMs, antecedents, triggers, and mediators that are influencing somebody's kind of health expression. And then, to go even further, I think, there's this new field of longevity-based medicine where we could apply additional levers of filtration and viewing functional medicine through a longevity lens, through the hallmarks of aging, your 12 hallmarks of aging. And I think each one of those hallmarks could be arguably measurable to determine beyond, just telomere length or clocks, biological aging clocks, which I'm not a huge fan of, and all these other kind of inputs to further refine that language of longevity-based clinical applications. And then functional medicine is the next layer of all of that. How do you use a matrix, ATMs, root cause analysis, and the functional medicine timeline in conjunction with longevity-based hallmarks of aging, through the lens of a well-structured molecular framework, and that is, I think, precision medicine.
And so, application-wise, if I came and saw you, what would be my experience as a patient working with you that you would see otherwise? Like, what else are you running that would be non-standard, quote unquote, non-standard?
It's if you come to me in person, we do everything from QEEG and brain mapping, VO2 max testing, in-body scans, full body MRIs, the whole silhouette of all these different kind of advanced forms of testing, just to pick up different signatures to see what's kind of going on below the surface. And so just taking a little bit further, leaning into the longevity concept and being able to identify any potential patterns that might be associated with early detection or additional screening. So when you come and see me, it's I tell people there's a million doctors out there, or not a million, but depending on who you call a doctor, but there's so many different folks out there, and I don't want to be your doctor. I want to become your health intelligence partner, where we could actually leverage this information to make meaningful decisions about your trajectory and health impact. I oftentimes, in my book, I use the analogy, what's called biological 401k. And I do believe that we all have this internal biological health savings accounts for which we're making daily deposits and withdrawals into. And it's different forms of, dare I say, epigenetic currency. So diet, exercise, sleep, relationships, meaning, and purpose are all making valuable deposits into our biological 401k. And unfortunately, all the fun things are making withdrawals from our 401k, and that could be staying out late and and indulging in certain things, and unfortunately that taxes our savings account. But ultimately, the amount of deposits and withdrawals that we have is going to culminate into an ROI, and that return on investment is going to be health span over a lifespan. And then furthermore, putting into context, the definition of health span, I think is, could be viewed in the context of what's called intrinsic capacity. Now, if you're not familiar with intrinsic capacity, it refers to the World Health Organization's categorization of healthy aging, where it's divided into 5 different domains, measurable domains of existence. It's very interesting. So, yeah.
Awesome.
So I've got to jump in here. I'm curious because something that I wrestle with a little bit in the world of functional medicine, functional health, there's more lab tests than ever, biomarkers, assays, methodologies, or, even the full body MRI scans are becoming more and more popular. And obviously, clinical context is everything. So meeting the client or patient where they're at, doing obviously the deep investigation into even their psychology. So my practice is very mental focused. And so I get a lot of anxiety, a lot of OCD. And so something that I have a hard time with or wrestle with is, is more data always better? Or is more testing always better? Because if it's feeding anxiety or intrusive thoughts or whatnot. And so I'd be curious, I definitely have like my staples, but I'm curious when it comes to the lab testing, which, by the way, I love that you do the VO2 testing. My background is a metabolic technician. And now that, VO2 is like the, one of the most valuable biomarkers of longevity in the body composition. But with lab testing, I'd be really curious, what are your kind of foundational lab tests that you use with everybody versus then how do we intelligently or responsibly like titrate in or layer in, additional lab testing based on, clinical suspicion? I'd be curious your general framework.
So, it depends, right, on how we're getting connected, and what you're coming to me for. I deal with everything from chronic complex illness to longevity-based interventions. And to what you said, is more information, more health, anxiety provoking, or is it more empowering? Sir William Osler, arguably the, conventional allopathic physician from Hopkins, part of the four horsemen of medicine, was once said that it's more important to know what type of person has a disease versus what type of disease a person has, because that psychological influences so many different kind of predispositions in your ability to heal. So when it comes down to it, if you're a nervous Nelly or anxious individual, you might want to dial back on some of the testing if it's going to be anxiety provoking. And sometimes less data is better, right? So it just depends on the individual. I'm a data guy. I'm a molecular biologist by training, and I like to connect those molecular dots. And for a lot of people that are suffering from maybe some questionable clinical symptomatic expressions, there could be some varying levels of influence in there, whether you're looking at it from strictly the lens of genomic-based applications and whether or not there's, direct your PTSD, production, transport, synthesis, or degradation with neurotransmitter issues, or whether you have some genes that are influencing your body's detox pathways. It just depends on who you are and where you're at. And I have patients that are trying to dial in and optimize every kind of domain of their existence to make sure that they're living a very well insulated life. But it's really interesting because when you start pulling back the layers, you're going to start identifying, maybe areas of focus and attention when it comes down to A, their genetic blueprint, B, their proteomic signature, C, their microbiomic expression, and D, their exposome, what they're environmentally exposed to. So it's just very interesting that we try to account for all these different variables, confounding variables that are influencing our health expression. But all it takes is, eating sushi and salmon, farm-raised salmon, a little bit too much to start having that bump in mercury, or, we're not filtering our water at home or at restaurants. And all of a sudden, you're starting to see these other contaminants making its way into your exposome, or you're having, weird plastics, even though you've tried to mitigate plastic exposure in your system, bioaccumulate in your system, or PFAS, or whatever it is. So this environmental genomic mismatch is kind of where it's very important to pay attention to, because this is where the rubber meets the road in regards to our health expression. We live in a very toxic world. And, it's just very interesting to see how this influences damage, accumulated damage, your body's inability to detox and deal with these different stress responses, and how that manifests, overall in your health expression clinically, whether it's symptomatically expressed or not. It's just very interesting to see. Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting in the self-actualization field. So I like to approach it almost from like that self-actualization philosophical approach. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I don't think I answered your question, though. I'm sorry. In regards to baseline panels, we could get into that later. But yeah, sorry, go on.
Well, I guess starting at the foundational blueprint, right? Not a lot of practitioners are using genetics, or they're not quite certain on how to use it. You obviously are very reliant looking at detox pathways. So kind of where do you, that being kind of the foundational blueprint, where do you start? What do you use? And what are you looking for specifically as you kind of wade into the depth of the data that you're pulling?
So it depends on the individual, and I want to make sure I'm respectful, with my position to not, seem biased towards one organization or another. But just depending on where you're entering the ecosystem, I will leverage different forms of testing. So there's several different DNA testing companies that I know, like, and trust. I even use transcriptomic data on my chronic complex illness patients, looking at RNA signatures. With that being said, it just depends, and not a lot of people have the tools or resources or means to do all of the testing. So I work with everybody based on where they're at in their journey, and try to be very mindful of what that looks like, because unfortunately sometimes this leads us into the conversation of sick building syndrome and water damaged buildings, secondary and associated with mold. And unfortunately, I'd rather have patients spend money on remediation of their home or whatever it is, versus spending money on me to do exorbitant amount of testing. I don't know if I answered your question. Did I?
Well, maybe like specific SNP clusters that you're looking at, right? So if you think Gary Brecka, everybody's MTHFR, right? But there's obviously a few more genetic SNPs and mutations that you're on the lookout for. So what do you look at?
So there's very specific pathways in regards to looking at somebody's blueprint and decoding that for clinical relevancy and application. I like to look at what's called, very specific genes, right? And whether it's in the lipidomic field and paying attention to like PCSK9, LP(a), CTEP, and a whole host of others that influence the kind of cardiometabolic disposition towards my patients. Because unfortunately, I think that a lot of the dyslipidemia or cholesterol-based kind of signatures are predicated on that genomic factor, 9p21 and a whole host of other genes. I like to look at genes that are involved with monoamine neurotransmitter synthesis and other neurotransmitters, because that plays a very important role with cognition. Obviously, there's a couple of genes that are involved with neurodegeneration that we pay attention to, whether or not you have ApoE. I know it's not the complete story, but there's strong research and evidence around that, and it's important to look at that in the broader context of other polygenic risk scores. And so polygenic risk score is a term that's used to say, hey, there's a cluster of genes that influence a specific pathophysiology, whether it's dementia, cardiovascular, or whatever. And there's some weighted evidence behind that to determine, hey, we got to pay attention to this. So I like to leverage polygenic risk scores to identify patterns in my patients. And, that coupled with a really detailed family history is going to be very important to identifying our threats to our longevity, where we need to pay attention to. And then, obviously those detox pathways, I pay very close attention to pharmacogenomics. One of my favorite genes to pay attention to is SLOCO1B1, as it's associated with statin-induced myopathy. And a lot of patients come to me on statins, and, they might have, some of the clinical manifestations of that. Oh, decreased exercise tolerance, blunted muscle hypertrophy, decreased adaptation to exercise due to, that mitochondrial insult, because statins, as you may know, is a HMG coenzyme reductase inhibitor. And that has a direct role on the different complexes within the mitochondria and our ability to use, food as energy, right? So that myopathy is a real thing. So it just really depends. I like to zoom out and zoom in, just depending on the data and information we have. So, looking at these different clusters of genes and its how it influences bioregulatory capacity is a very important concept for me. And I like to pay attention to everything from brain, cardiovascular, metabolic, dietary associations with the nutrigenomic factors, beyond, MTHFR, beyond, VDR, and all these other things in regards to the nutritional influences. And then, there's also like the ACMG cluster of genes that are associated with cancer disease risk predisposition. That's also very important to pay attention to. So everything from nutrigenomics, cancer disease profiles, pharmacogenomics, polygenic risk scores, all of those play a very important role in the adoption of identifying who the hell you're talking to, because everybody's blueprint's different, man, and it's just the luck of the draw, right? Yeah. Genetically. Did I answer the question that time?
Yeah, I think so. I personally, obviously there's all these layers that I'm trying to consider when I'm consulting with somebody. What's their budget, right? That's a huge factor, because I'd love to run all the lab testing in the world if, we lived in a world where budget didn't matter. But then when I'm trying to get them like the most bang for their buck, so I'm usually trying to cast a broad net of blood work to capture their current state of physiology. I do love some organic acids testing, a little bit more for the biochemical insights. Something I'd be curious, because you're obviously collecting a lot of data, and that's a lot to try to hold it in your head and make sense of. And something that I wrestle with a little bit is, obviously we're going to assign more clinical weight to a data point that has a stronger body of evidence to support its clinical utility and significance, right? So even like on an organic acids test, which is something I use pretty regularly in my practice, well, not all of those organic acid markers have the same weight of evidence. And so sometimes I like to joke that I like to keep my feet on the ground, but my head in the clouds, sort of joking about like, well, I want to stay rooted in objective evidence, but I also want to stay open to what we don't know yet, and maybe with time and more research. So I'd be curious, as you're integrating, this mastermind of all these different data points, and how you're able to essentially create that, maybe not always perfectly linear, but illuminating that path for that patient based on sort of that blueprint, that framework that you're discussing.
Yeah, and that's a secret sauce, right? In regards to how do we connect those molecular dots, identify patterns of dysfunction, and determine, what the therapeutic order and prioritization is. OAT testing is good. I definitely think it's going to, provide some additional insight about mitochondrial deficits. It's going to provide insight on metabolic issues, and maybe even neurotransmitter excitotoxicity, and a couple of other very interesting pathways. But I think the art of medicine is going to be, how are you able to kind of match some of these molecular diagnostics with the symptomatic presentation of the patient in front of you. My questionnaire and intake is close to 50 pages long, super annoying and obnoxious, I know. But, that's going to really streamline our conversation once we get into our dialogue here in clinic, because, a lot of it, the information gathering, again, following that IFM heuristic, the go-to-it heuristic that they endorse, which is gather, organize, tell, order, initiate, track, is very important. So I'd rather gather, organize, and tell before we even have a conversation. So I like, all right, you got these issues, you got this symptomatic profile, and how to connect those molecular dots. But if somebody comes to you and they're just, suffering from, unfortunately, a whole host and multitude of different issues, multi-system, multi-symptom expression, issues, you've got to start peeling back the layers, and it's going to, you're going to see those mitochondrial insults, you're going to see micronutrient deficiencies, you're going to see metabolic derangement and everything else. But what's the root cause that's driving that? Is it genetics, or is it an environmental genetic mismatch? For me, it's 25 years of putting all this together to, ultimately, just make sense of it in my crazy brain. One of the techniques that I don't advertise that I like to do in my practice is I like to look at blood. I thought I wanted to be a hematopathologist originally when I was 19 years old. My high school wrestling coach / jujitsu coach got me into a technique using dark field phase contrast microscopy. Bought a microscope when I was 19, started analyzing everybody's blood, got trained on it. And that's what influenced my pursuit in micro and med lab sciences. And, one drop of blood, honestly, Again, I'm not diagnosing anything from it, but it's going to point us in a direction that gives us a different picture than standard laboratory testing. Everybody orders a CBC and a CMP. That's cute. That's good, right? But what CBC, what are you looking at? What are those different indices really telling you? You're looking at red blood cell size, shape, distribution, and morphology, and the differential in the white blood cell count. But guess what? Microscopically, when you're looking at those cells, man, there's a totally different picture when you're starting to see variations of red blood cell size, known as anesicytosis, that won't be captured in those indices on a standard CBC. You'll also start seeing like echonocytes and poikilocytes and all sorts of spiky red blood cells associated with membrane lipid peroxidation. You'll start seeing fibrinogen networks associated with hypercoagulation. You'll see endotoxemia and bacteria floating around in the blood due to increased gut permeability and metabolic endotoxemia. Crazy, right? So I like to use that as like a qualitative assessment to just get an idea what's going on in the terrain of the blood, and then that could point us in a direction of where we need to go. So I'm a mad scientist. I like to connect all those molecular dots and leverage all the different tools to determine what we need to prioritize.
Awesome. Just got a question came in. Just go ahead and throw that out there. When you look at the intersection of metabolic health, mental health, and multi-omic data, what is the single most underappreciated connection that you wish more practitioners were paying attention to right now? And then also, how can AI play a part alongside health intelligence?
So, I want to make sure I'm answering it correctly. So the interface of metabolic, mental, and
multi-omic data. And it was actually kind of similar. I had the similar question. So you have all of this objective lab data. Now you're literally looking at blood data as well. And you have a 50-page intake form. How do you weight all of those three sources of information in terms of what's important?
3, way more than that. Again, so I do something what's called a biological audit when you come into my practice, right? There's a couple of non-negotiables, right? And, putting that into context, again, there's a bunch of doctors out there. There's a bunch of functional doctors out there. Go there. If you're not bought into, my philosophical approach, that's totally fine. I'm not everybody's cup of tea, but how I like to connect those dots, it really just depends on the individual. Everything is N of 1. So I hate making these sweeping generalizations of, this is the specific way of doing something, because I would say my greatest teachers are my patients, right? And I'm learning from my patients more so than from clinical journals. Journals are going to plant the seed of intention and maybe give you a framework of how to think. But the patients, are going to, when somebody's suffering, from whatever illness it may be, they're going to force us to dig deeper and try to identify what's mediating their pathophysiology. So the interface of multi-omic data, mental health, and metabolic issues, I think, is going to be highly predicated on, all the different factors, right? And the foundational stuff. Are you sleeping well? Are you exercising well? Are you having meaning and purpose? What's your nutrition right? Are you supplementing? Do you have any micronutrient deficiencies? All those are foundational, right? Functional medicine, primary care medicine, but when you start peeling back the layers, you're going to start identifying patterns that are, in most individuals, unique to their individuality. So I like to say that the future of precision medicine is going to really transform the taxonomy of disease, because what we are now reducing to ICD-10 code diagnostics is going to be completely flipped on its head once we start understanding the multi-omic layers influencing and driving disease progression, right? So everybody's heart disease, Alzheimer's, whatever the heck it is, name it a condition, any condition. Jeff Bland has his book, The Disease Delusion, right? Is going to be predicated based on their unique molecular pathophenotype. Mm-hmm. And so, what's underappreciated, I think, is the role of the microbiome and metabolic endotoxemia driving chronic inflammation. There's so much more to it. I don't even know where to begin.
So maybe just kind of building off that second and then Brendan, I'll let you jump in on that second statement around how AI can play a part in this, right? So you have function, superpower, 100 Health, you name your blood testing company, they're all building AI doc in your pocket, right? And so I guess apparently longitudinal blood chemistry data is going to be everything that you need. Yet I'm hearing something very different from you in terms of your approach. So I'd love to get your take on your I guess, general fear that keeps you up at night that you're going to be replaced by an AI app.
Yeah, so I use AI. Precision medicine is going to be AI first. And I can tell you now, it's not 100%. I think the language models will get refined as we go. I think it's a great tool to kind of, infuse with your provider. So AI co-pilots are going to be, I think, instrumental to crunching this data because, technically true multi-omic medicine is three layers of multi-omics and 5,000 data points. As a doctor, you think you got, enough time to go through 3 layers and 5,000 data points? No, right? So what we're going to have to rely on AI to crunch this information to deliver very meaningful kind of pattern recognitions that are going to bring to us, what we need to prioritize. And I'm already seeing all these glitches and hallucinations and so forth in different AI tools. And it's not to say they're bad. They're definitely going to be great. And we're going to need AI first to aggregate this information in a meaningful, translatable way. But the art of medicine comes when, you're sitting eyeball to eyeball with your patient, and nobody wants a readout. It could be nice to have these integrations, in your pocket. I saw the superpower AI announcement from yesterday or whatever it is, and honestly, their language models. I'm not going to say anything negative, but all these different models are going to be refined with time, and I think the pattern recognition is going to be phenomenal, and we're really going to move into an era of medicine where it really is P4 medicine. It's personalized, predictive, preventative, and there's going to be that participatory component in it. Again, that term P4 medicine was coined by our director of systems biology with the Board of Precision Medicine, Dr. Lee Hood, who just won the Lifetime Achievement Award at the IHS conference this past weekend. So yeah, I think AI is very important, but I really am not fearful at all of being replaced because I don't know about you, but sometimes it gets very frustrating dealing with some of these AI tools because it's not doing exactly what you need. But I think they're great. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, well, yeah, I have a million thoughts. So I was kind of going off last week about this a little bit. The irony, and I do have a simple question. I was kind of going off last week about how we live in this age where anybody can get on AI, let's say like a standard American person, standard American metabolism, standard American gut, lifestyle, diet, the works, right? Metabolically compromised, maybe there's some psycho-emotional dysfunction there as well. So we live in a world where like anybody can hop on ChatGPT, and even if they put in tons of personal information to try to get a very individualized plan, and is it perfect? No. Is it a replacement for licensed healthcare providers? Absolutely not. But it's pretty damn good, right? But the irony is somebody could pump out a really comprehensive workout plan or protocol or health building program, but are they going to do it? Are they going to follow it? Are they going to be compliant with it? So I do have a simple question just to help my own understanding of your practice. Are most of your patients like really high functioning, high performers that are trying to optimize, but then also or maybe a percentage breakdown, like the high performers trying to optimize, the standard Americans that really just have a lot of behavioral lifestyle foundational building to do. But then we've touched on it, and I'm kind of wanting to push us there a little bit more, the complex chronic illness, where these people are so compromised that they need more, passive care because they can't, overhaul their diet and lifestyle overnight. They need, to build up their vital reserve through various treatment modalities to then be able to help themselves. So I'm just kind of curious the composition of your practice with, I'm sure it's very diverse, but for context.
Honestly, that's a great question. I used to work with Dr. Andrew Heyman he was director of A4M and also the director at GW for their integrative department. And we saw the sickest of the sick, chronic mold, Lyme, and all sorts of infectious issues, and people on, I don't want to say their deathbed, but you couldn't even get out of bed. And the sickest of the sick, we were the last stop on the train. And, this is where I got a really good taste of, precision medicine as a whole. So unfortunately, I got burnt out, from dealing with that because, that type of medicine, chronic complex illness does require a lot of resources. You need to have the appropriate infrastructure in place to do that. And for my practice right now, I'm a minimalist, as I like the data, exorbitant amount of data, but I keep things really simple, really, really chill. And in my office, I'm all about this health optimization, kind of narrative. And I've got all sorts of toys, tools, and technologies. I've got hyperbaric oxygen. I do EBU. I've pulse electromagnetic field, extra EWAT therapy, intermittent hypoxic hyperoxic therapy. I've got all the gizmos and gadgets. So to answer your question of, the composition now, I've got everybody that I'm cool with, right? And if you're cool, I'll work with you. But there's been historically, some times where we're just not aligned, and that's it, right? A lot of conventional medicine has this, I used to call it the F you fix me attitude, right? Come in, doc, give me a pill, right? Whatever it is, right? I've been through that, and they didn't want to make those changes. And that's the bulk of primary care, is some of that. So now in my clinical practice, I want to make sure we're aligned, right? And that we could, work together in a comprehensive fashion. But my patients are, being here in Maryland right now, a lot of government folks, I have a lot of physicians that are my patients. So I like to say I'm like the doctor's doctor, right? Because they appreciate this multi-omic layer that I'm doing more so than anybody else, because they understand that this is the future of healthcare. So a lot of my patients are physicians, CEOs, lawyers, attorneys, and so forth. And then, their network who could be dealing with a chronic complex illness. But so it's a spectrum. And I've just reached this point right now where I just want to make sure that we're aligned, philosophically. Expectations are managed. There is that, doctor-patient or coach-athlete kind of, relationship that needs to be formed. And if, we're not aligned, it's okay. We could review your data and then you could find somebody else to hold your hand. It's all good.
Yeah.
And with all your gadgets, how do those fit in, right? So you've got 3 layers, 5,000 data points, but now you got EBU, hyperbaric, PEMF. Where does that even fit in? How do you kind of get somebody onto a protocol? Like, how do you think about, is there a certain profile? Is there a certain kind of decision structure that you have as to determine who does what?
Well, it's actually more than 3 layers. The minimal criteria for multi-omics is three layers, 5,000 data points. I do at minimum 5 layers, right? And then for certain individuals, we go even deeper. So it just depends, right? But again, there is no standardized protocol, right? It's what's going on right now. So for example, a lot of it's going to be, blood filtration mechanisms, and there's really good research around some of these different oxidative therapies and going in there and maybe removing some of the, bioaccumulated toxic material in their system, pre and post. We're actually going to be publishing on this. Me and the board are a part of the Human Exposome Project, the Moonshot project that launched last year with the NIH and Hopkins and Columbia University. And so, this environmental context is very important. And it goes beyond just taking some random supplements and quote unquote detox, but really having pre-post testing and identifying what needs to be targeted. So there is a therapeutic order. And before you even jump into like photobiomodulation, you don't want to go in there and potentiate a bad mitochondria. If your mitochondria is stressed and you have cell danger response and molecular hypometabolism, you don't go in there and stress it even further with red light. That's stupid, right? So, there's a very specific targeted therapeutic order, and the technologies help move the needle. Because when you go in there and you're removing, repairing, replacing whatever it is, a lot of people have gut issues and their malabsorption patterns are really high. So you could throw them on a ton of supplements. It's not gonna move the needle for them, right? Acutely. So it just depends on who they are and where they're at. But if you're an athlete and you're pretty much dialed in, oh man, it's field day with the technologies we have, and with the goal of enhancing performance, and how do we dial that in and, look at lactate testing and VO2 testing to determine your appropriate exercise thresholds, and how do we feed performance, so that we could get you to the most optimized state. So it just really depends. But I love EBU. I think extracorporeal blood oxygenation is a technique, not FDA approved, but, I think there's tremendous research around ozone therapy. It's been around for over 100 years right now. And, on a molecular level, whenever you could upregulate NRF2 signaling versus taking a bunch of exogenous antioxidants, I think it's a better way of doing things versus, supplementing to death with a bunch of stuff that who knows if it's going to be good for you. So it just depends on the individual and what we're seeing based on the data.
I'd be curious on the complex chronic illness, because I respect all the experience you have, and it's a demographic I've worked with quite a bit myself. And to your point, it can be very exhausting, because it just requires a lot of emotional investment, both ways, right? I'd be curious to learn a little bit more about your perspective on, and to maybe provide some context. It's like, you kind of think of that standard American metabolism, sure, but there's also this growing demographic of complex chronic illness. And then I think sometimes it can be hard to determine, does this person really have complex chronic illness versus like how much is the nocebo effect, or kind of building this increasingly complex narrative that they get stuck in and they start identifying with. How do we delineate between like psychological dysfunction and physiological dysfunction, especially when they're exacerbating and potentiating one another? But I'd be curious to hear you kind of go off a little bit, because you mentioned the toxic world, the toxic burden, and the genetic susceptibility. Why do you feel like we're seeing this, growing, and dare I even say rapidly growing demographic of this complex chronic illness? And some of the etiological factors, specifically, you mentioned PFAS and glyphosate and all these things, so on and so forth. Genetic characteristics that might be potentiating that dysfunctional phenotype, and how you begin to approach unraveling that complex chronic illness. I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
So that's a great question. And I would say this, I think that, where precision medicine will always have a blind spot, potentially, is the lack of maybe the psycho-emotional component. Even though we know that there is this phenomenon of transgenerational epigenetic programming associated with trauma, and looking at, in my days of dealing with this, there are individuals that have the FKBP5 gene upregulated, which could be associated with PTSD and trauma, which is a very important component within all of this. And then, identifying the unique molecular signatures. So one of the underutilized omic data points commercially right now is the utilization of transcriptomics. There's a lot of spatial temporal factors that influence its expression. And again, for the audience, the transcriptome, again, is looking at the RNA signature, but I like to use the analogy that essentially, your DNA are the instruments of your own personal symphony orchestra, right? And each instrument is gonna, strings, brass, whatever, is gonna play a unique melody or tone. But how it's tuned is gonna be influenced based on those environmental kind of factors. So if we have a stress from the environment, we might have upregulation or playing too loud, a very specific gene expression. Or it could be downregulated and turned down in volume and in expression based on that stress pattern. So the transcriptome has taught me a lot. And it goes back to this concept in medicine called cell danger response, for example. So as it related to metabolic state, the work of Dr. Robert Navidow from UCSD, looking at how these environmental exposures that influence mitochondrial sensing and how that influences, the mitochondria's ability to generate ATP. The most common symptom that everybody has is I'm tired, right? They're just tired, right? Mm-hmm. And why are they tired? Do they have decreased exercise tolerance? Are they not sleeping well? Is it a hypoxic issue? There are all these different factors that can influence fatigue, right? And what we see clinically within the transcriptome is a phenomenon called molecular hypometabolism, which deals with the mitochondria transcriptome dealing with that cell danger response. So, and there are different phases of cell danger response. So it's going to be very important to identify that threat, right, and that insult. And to further unravel it, there is a subset of the population. Our work that we did through George Washington University and with Dr. Heyman's practice had to deal with this issue called CIRS. CIRS stands for chronic inflammatory response syndrome. And essentially, the theory behind it is, well, it's not theory. There's multiple publications, RCTs, double-blind placebo-controlled trials, but that there is a subset of the population that carries a very specific genetic haplotype, and that is immunologically predisposed towards environmental hypersensitivities to these different biotoxin-related insults. And when those individuals are exposed to those different threats, they turn on a part of their immune system that doesn't have the ability to turn off. And what ends up happening is this post-exposure inflammatory immune-mediated sequelae. And this spills over into multiple different tissues throughout the body. And this goes beyond measuring mycotoxins in the urine, right? Because that's not going to be clinically validated and or supported in the court of law if you've ever dealt with these issues and it goes to trial. Doing a urinary mycotoxin test will be used against you in the court of law, actually, in certain situations. So, making sure, that's a very slippery slope in that world as it relates to that kind of illness. And it's very prevalent. It's very common. These are the same people that have COVID long haul syndrome, same people that have chronic post-Lyme syndrome, and you kind of know who they are in your patient population and the community as a whole, unfortunately. So it's a multi-symptom, multi-syndrome illness that I think is very underrepresented. And, we need to get physicians and doctors and patients trained up on this, because over 50% of the buildings and infrastructures in the US have water damaged buildings, and it goes beyond mold. It's actually, most water damaged buildings have polymicrobial manifestations, meaning multiple different forms and organisms. And based on the research we did and looked at it through the university, we found that most people are dealing with a bacteria called actinomycetes that is influencing this immune provocation. And actinomycetes is essentially a gram-positive facultative anaerobic spore-forming filamentous bacteria. What did I just say? It's a bacteria that looks and behaves like a mold. It's almost like the life bridge between prokaryote and eukaryote, a bacteria and like a human or a mold cell, with the spore formation and the filamentous formation. It could be colonized on your skin. And why is this important? Because these biotoxins activate a part of your immune system called complement, right? And complement C4A, there's three different pathways of complement activation. There's MBL, mannose binding lectin pathway, classical pathway, and the alternative pathway. And when you have complement activation through the MBL, through a biomarker that could be ordered from preferably National Jewish in Colorado, but Quest historically used them as their reference lab, you could get the biomarker C4A. And you see C4A elevations, complement 4 activation elevated in your patients. The end result is something called MAC, membrane attack complex. Well, what the hell is that doing? That sounds bad. MAC, right? It's poking holes in your cells. It's causing your cells to be leaky. It's causing it to have accelerated, degeneration and apoptosis, right? So we could see these very unique molecular signatures from the genome to the transcriptome to the proteome to the metabolome, the microbiome, and the exposome, right? And those translational applications as it relates to that. So I hope I answered your question in regards to, kind of what I see and unraveling it. But, yeah.
Yeah, it's a deep subject. I can just hear, because I'll post about these things on social media. I think I just recently recycled a post about cell danger response. And so then what do I get in the comments? People are like, well, how do you turn off the cell danger response, right? Because I think sometimes people misinterpret some of my content, and it maybe can come across like, fear mongering or something, which is not what I'm trying to do. It's let's raise awareness about these things so we can offer, evidence-based solutions. So I'm thinking actually kind of my audience. I would be like, okay, well, Brendan, Dr. Anil, Jeremy, I've got, the dreaded HLA and the MTHFR and the CBS and slow Compton, I'm living in mold and all these things. It can become very self-defeating. So I guess I would kind of be curious to hear your take on, do you feel like, obviously we can't change the genotype, right? But we can modulate the phenotype through environmental intervention, psychological, physiological. So do you feel like there is, optimism with, hey, unfortunately, you are one of those canaries in the coal mine that is United States in the modern world, where we are being exposed to unprecedented, levels of whether it's the VOCs or mycotoxins or PFAS or whatever it is, the nanoplastics. Are they just kind of screwed, or is there hope with the right, if we can identify their, molecular signatures and titrate the right interventions, will we be able to, successfully move them out of that chronic inflammatory response or the cell danger response as well?
So I don't think you're screwed. I think, there's always hope. Mm-hmm. And, but what I found clinically over, seeing, I don't know how many patients that were suffering from this illness, it always goes back to step one, phase one, right? Removing yourself from ongoing exposure. And that's the hardest part. Mm-hmm. The remediation process is the hardest part. Throwing away all of your, your worldly possessions in certain instances, burning your house down to the ground, and maybe even getting a divorce or two in between is the end result. Unfortunately, that kind of why I left, managing that on a regular basis, because it's really challenging. It's emotionally taxing for me because I really care about my patients. I love my patients. And that's why if we're going to engage in this relationship, I want to make sure that I'm 100% dialed in and as my patient. There is hope, but the hardest part is step one in this entire insult and process. Now, what's to come, whether you can leverage, other kind of, disease modifying agents and whether it's peptides or, whatever it might be, TBD, right? It's a stepwise therapeutic approach that's going to come with, short little wins. But I can tell you now, within that protocol that I've been trained in and conditioned in, there are these little kind of checkpoints. And once we get past those checkpoints, there's incremental improvements in symptomatic, mitigation. So I think, as long as you're humming along and you're doing that, you could do the refinement later on, but just making sure that there's no ongoing exposure. And step one is going to be the most important step in this entire process. And, the research and evidence is growing. It's not a matter of throwing CoQ10, PQQ, urolithin A, or whatever at the mitochondria that's already stressed or taxed. That's actually, I think, very negligent to do. It's not a matter of throwing hormones or BPC or whatever the hell it is, drug of the month, at somebody. It's having a very systematic therapeutic application that is driven by data to make the clinical decision behind what's going on. So I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I would echo a lot of that. What I like about something I really liked about what you just said, though, was like the small incremental wins with a lot of my background training, very heavy emphasis on like behavioral psychology and how you effectively coach people through, the behavior modification, right? Because if the clinical outcomes are dictated largely by of course, the environment, but both the literal environment, but also kind of the psychological, energetic environment, if you will, but the day-to-day lifestyle choices and behaviors. So I'd be curious to maybe to get your take on, I think the trick to your point is building up those micro wins, right? You know, there's a time to kind of go for the low hanging fruit. Other times like, hey, let's try to tackle this big kahuna. That's, you know, maybe the divorce that you've been neglecting for too long. That's a major, you know, stressor on your system, on your biology, right? So I'd be curious if Dr. Neil has any tips or tricks on how to build up those wins, or the behavioral piece, the compliance piece. You know, do you have health coaches in your practice that support the clients in some of the day-to-day, you know, hand holding, if you will?
So when I was dealing with SIRS, yes, we did. I think Jenny Johnson out of Colorado is probably going to be one of the greatest resources and advocates for this community. Also, you know, I love Scott McMahon, Eric Doringer. I was just with Doringer in New York this past weekend. Love those guys. And those are your subject matter experts. They have the teams around to support that. So that's why, you know, unfortunately, I have a very, you know, with all the different responsibilities that I have, I'm very limited in my clinical capacity. You know, it's, you know, kind of a 60-40 split between what I'm doing in office versus what I'm doing for the Board of Precision Medicine, with the ultimate goal of maybe scaling myself out of the clinical setting and just hyper-focusing on the future of healthcare and the Board of Precision Medicine. But in regards to, you know, motivational interviewing and being able to provide additional tools and resources, I think, you know, a lot of folks get, you know, quick wins once their energy starts improving, because, you know, we start off with your symptomatic baseline. And when we, you know, every check-in, we're able to reassess, you know, those improvements. And when, you know, objectively, we could show and demonstrate that, you know, not only are your biomarkers are improving, your symptomatic manifestations are improving, or the neuroinflammatory burden is improving, you know. So in regards to the behavioral component, you know, it's I think providing the appropriate tools and resources for successful deployment of actionable steps is going to be very important for patients. And I try my best to just give everybody everything that I have, so that, you know, they just have the resources needed. But right now I don't have a health coach per se, and not opposed to bringing on a health coach. I just, you know, it's a split in time and labor right now with all the things I'm juggling.
I have to say, just maybe this is a selfish comment, but for me, this is an extremely fulfilling conversation of, you know, a prestigious medical doctor. But I feel like we're right there, because something I think about a lot is with functional medicine and, let's say, functional health coaching, that line is getting thinner and thinner. So I got to give a shout out to, you know, our FDN communities and all the functional health coaches, because we're elevating and meeting the doctors in the middle on this line here of functional medicine, functional health coaching. We need these things to go hand in hand. And Jeremy, I know you heard it. There are a few beautiful lines in there, right? Of if we're tracking the data and aggregating it, we can see the symptom burden is improving, the biomarkers are improving. I also, you know, like to use different psychological domain evaluations so we can see their quality of life. So I just, you know, Dr. Neil, this is such a great conversation, because I'm with you, man.
Oh, thank you. No, it means a lot. And the thing is, you're probably speaking to somebody that's just, you know, again, I've been doing this for so long now. And, you know, I started off, you know, studying the nutraceutical space and the functional medicine space as a teenager. You know, I remember sitting with Datis Karazian, who's big in our community, you know, a functional neurologist out there in San Diego. And, you know, back when I had hair and I was still like, you know, fresh out of high school, he's like, what the hell are you doing here? You know, like, you should be trying to get into med school. So I've just, you know, after studying with, you know, everybody from University of Arizona with Andrew Weil, I studied with the Germans and Swiss with Dr. Thomas Rau, the Paracelsus Clinic of Biological Medicine, medical acupuncture at University of Miami, clinical homeopathy with CEDH, the ABC, American Botanical Council, and all these different things. I've just gathered all this information and see where each modality potentially has a therapeutic role or intervention based on, again, not, you know, it's not about what type of disease a person has, but what type of person has the disease, right? and matching that to their, philosophical alignment. And so it's a very beautiful journey. I don't know. I just enjoy what I do, connecting the dots. I'm a data nerd, and I love Biocanic and everything that Jeremy's trying to do, and within the community and for the mission as a whole.
And maybe last minute, hopefully you got a couple more minutes just to cover off. So obviously, you've seen the Nexus product where we're kind of giving the practitioner the ability to look at that information. And I jokingly say we're answering a question practitioners didn't know they had, in terms of being able to do like cross correlation. Hey, Firmicutes and my sleep score is negatively correlated. Okay. But now you've kind of taken that, which is kind of your foundational functional medicine where people are already kind of inefficient. We provide those tools, but now you're next level, right? Even more markers, even more intake questions, even more data. How do you see this unfolding into a world where there's more than one of you that's able to actually work with individuals that aren't just the people that you like?
Threw that in at the end there.
And that's the thing, after years of not having a say on, who's been brought into my ecosystem to see if we're a good fit, I've reached this point now where I think the greater global impact is going to be training the future physicians on how to, kind of think this way. It's not even me, man. If you're to look at the industry as a whole, look at Illumina just released their new next generation NextSeq machine, where in one box, right? If you think where we came from with the Human Genome Project and where we are today, and the ability to do whole genome sequencing for, dare I say, around $100, right? The next iterations of these technologies that are, in these commercial labs are instruments that have the ability to do complete molecular multi-omic profiling. And like, for example, Illumina's new CEO is all about the multi-omic narrative. And I think industry is going to drive innovation and adoption in regards to the commercialization of these different diagnostic tests, beyond RUO, research use only, into implementation clinically. And with that being said, their new machine, man, I'm telling you, one sample could get whole genome sequencing, complete transcriptomic profiling, epigenetics, like real epigenetics, not clock gene nonsense. And it's doing proteomics, and there's an omic I'm missing: epigenetics, transcriptomics, proteomics, and whole genome sequencing. So those 4 big omic data points, right? I think, so I really think the industry is going to be driving that charge and initiative. And now my attempt is to bring it beyond the classroom, and into a wider training arena for training the future physicians on, on basically where medicine's going, whether we agree with it or not. You could all think I'm full of shit, but the reality is, if you look at the research and data and the publications, it's all using multi-omic profiling now to paint that narrative of somebody's, pathophenotype or disease process, and looking at interventions. Just follow me on LinkedIn and you'll see all the different posts that I have. This is a new narrative. The problem is, how do we translate this bench to bedside adoption into practice and implementation? And how do we develop, the clinical protocols and, evidence-based solutions around this? But this is going to have, for doctors, to take a step back from the conditioning. So PhDs are taught how to think, MDs are taught what to think. And I think that it's going to be very important that we take a step back and really think for ourselves and question authority, and realize the RCT double-blinded placebo-controlled trials are developed for a biopharmaceutical model. Right. And now we're entering this new era of N of 1, where all these different data points are really influencing the flavor of disease expression. And for someone, it could be raging dysbiosis, metabolic endotoxemia, and all sorts of other things that are driving their issue. It could be environmentally induced with all the crazy crap in our environment. It just, there's so many different things. So, but my goal is to drive innovation and hopefully adoption amongst providers to think this way. And it's not just me. My team are all, the top PhDs, MDs in the field, because, you don't want to hear it from one guy. You want to see it from the leading experts in the field.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point. And I always roll my eyes when you see kind of the next direct to consumer one test, and I'm going to tell you everything about what you need to do. And, oh, it's this stool test, you run one stool test, or, oh, it's, HSCRP or other things. And this kind of reductionist approach, unfortunately, it is helpful in that it's moving the needle for people to kind of move into healthcare like this, but then it's also setting unrealistic expectations because of the combinations and permutations and underlying complexity of what it means to be a human in a toxic soup, right?
Exactly.
Maybe just with the last minute, give a plug for the American Board of Precision Medicine, what you guys are doing. And if anybody's interested, just kind of where to follow up on that, because I think that kind of summarizes everything that you do and what is now a educational training program.
Yeah, so the ABOPM, the American Board of Precision Medicine, is basically, a 501(c) that is beginning to enroll its initial cohort through the first level of precision health initiative in education, medical education. It's grounded in, this multi-Omic framework, network analysis, and systems biology. And so that's theabopm.org. And we had our first conference last year, ASU, Arizona State University, with their School of Medicine. We plan on another event later this year, and we have two educational verticals that are coming to market. One is around precision individualized medical interventions, and the other is around precision oncology, because the greatest clinical use case of precision medicine right now is oncology and PGX, but how do we take that now to the precision health side? And then I have my private practice, the Institute for Human Optimization. It's ifho.org, and these are my two main ecosystems for which, on the physician side and on the consumer side.
So, well, awesome. This has been great. It's definitely, we got to nerd out on quite a bit of data. It's way down. I think I said we're going to go way down the rabbit hole, which is even deeper down the rabbit hole than we normally go. But appreciate you joining us. We'll definitely post those links in the follow-up chat in the comments. Definitely comment. We'll make sure we get those questions to Dr. Anil if you do have any after this. But Brendan, Anil, it's great seeing you guys. And come back next month for another deep dive into something functional and precision. Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
See ya.